All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hoot, where we cover things like Envoy, ETO, technology you all care about. Today, we're going to talk about Envoy and integrating external services. Hopefully, you like the topic. We have, as always, a little bit of presentation, a little bit of a demo. And everybody in the chat, first, feel free to say hi, so I know you're there. And then if you have any questions, feel free, of course, to ask them live, and I will try and answer them live right here on the stream. All the code is also of the demo is also in our GitHub repo. So if you want to follow along, you can go to GitHub solo.io/Hoot, and you will see the code right there. And of course, if you like what you're seeing, share it with other people and subscribe to our channel. We do these Hoots every 2 weeks or so, kind of trying to get people more educated about, cloud native technologies. All right, and with that, assuming everything's good, let me start with my slides. Everybody hear me okay? Anybody in the chat can say hi just to make sure that the stream is going okay. All right, so Envoy and external services. Let's start with why do we even need those? So Envoy as a component on its own is stateless, right? It doesn't have any state that it holds long term. So if you're doing anything in your application that requires some global state or some mutable state, you probably need an external service in order to achieve that, right? So examples, rate limiting, where you have a counter that is updated on each request, right? So Envoy cannot store data on its own. It calls out to a rate limit service to have that global state. Another reason you might want is a time and memory trade-off. So for example, if you have a large user database that takes a large amount of memory, you probably don't want that in every Envoy instance. So you trade off time. You trade off time to get better memory utilization across the whole cluster by calling out to an external service that holds the all the data in memory. So these are examples of why you want it in the request path. There's also examples why you want external services outside the request path. Telemetry, control, observability. You want logs, metric, traces. XDS is kind of an external configuration service that's used to control Envoy. All right, so far, if there's any questions, feel free to type them in. Let's talk a little bit about trade-offs. So obviously, if you're doing calling an external service in the request path, there will be latency implications, right? Making a network call costs latency, probably around a millisecond. It could be more, could be less, obviously depending on your setup. It's kind of like of a rule of thumb here. And in addition, network call represents a new opportunity of failure, right? And I think a large portion of cloud native and distributed systems is understanding and observing failures in general, right? So when we introduce a new network call, we introduce a new point where the system can fail. So we need to understand how it behaves on failure and whether or not we can observe these failures, right? If we can get alerts on them, see if anything is unusual, so we can mitigate issues as they come up. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the services existing in Envoy today. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, just a few examples before we get to kind of live demo, kicking the tires a little bit. So in Envoy, we have a wealth of existing external services that Envoy natively supports. So let's start with external auth. So this is probably the most popular integration that I see for Envoy, right? Envoy can issue a check request to an external authorization service. It can be a gRPC service and it can be an HTTP service. And if the check passes, the request is allowed, And if the request does not pass, it's rejected. For example, this is how you can integrate open policy agent, with Envoy, is through external authorization, right? So open policy agent have implemented the external authorization interface, right? So you can use them with Envoy. So yes. Itzy also supports configuring external authorization because this is so popular. Our product Glue supports external authorization and allows you to expand, add abilities to Envoy like OPA, OpenID Connect. So this is the one is very popular. Now this is on the request path, right? To use it, you'll need to use a filter, and when we go to the demo part, we'll show how it looks in the Envoy configuration, how you add the filter. So what happens if it fails? If it fails, by default, the request is rejected, right? There's no retries, there's nothing along these lines for external auth. The request will simply be rejected with a default error code. I think the default is 403, and this is tunable. You can change the error code, you can change whether it will fail at all, you can configure it to be allowed on failure. But this is just the default behavior. And again, in demo, we'll see how to configure this and a really simple example of an external server. So rate limiting. Rate limiting is also can be, so Envoy has several types of rate limiting. There's some rate limiting filters that do not call out to an external service, but if you really want a global rate limit, there's no way around doing an external call, right? Because the counters for how many things you need to limit, they have to live somewhere, in a global place that all Envoy get the same counter, right? Whenever requests come, you increment the counter, and when the counter passes a limit, you start denying requests. So this is also on the request path. Envoy makes a call. It's called should rate limit to a gRPC service, and if it passes, the request is allowed. If it does not, the request is denied. Unlike external auth, in a failure case, and when I say failure, it means not that the check itself didn't pass, it means that you fail calling the service, some network failure, maybe the pod got restarted, whatever it may be. And in this case, by default, and again, it can be changed through configuration, by default, the request will be allowed. So these are the two services in our example that are on the request path. The other services we're going to talk about are not in the request path. Any questions so far, feel free to drop a line in the chat. I hope everybody seeing here and okay. Now, we have the request going upstream, response. The stream is the HTTP stream, meaning the request and response are now over. Let's see what happens next, and that's why we have here access logs. So Envoy has, and I've shown this on previous shows, you can access log to a file, to std out, and if you're using Kubernetes, that's probably what you're doing right now anyway, outputting to std out, and having the system take care of it. You can also provide access logs to a gRPC service, and you can also do both at the same time. So you can output, let's say, for example, all your access logs to std out, and in addition, some of the access log you can apply a filter. Let's say all the requests that are 403 or all the requests that are 500, or all the requests period, whatever you want, it's configurable, right? And log those to a gRPC access log service, right? So you can kind of get more advanced logic if you care about that, or more real time, even though it's not exactly real time. So you can do either, you can do both, you can do neither, but with the access log service, Envoy will stream the access log in gRPC, i.e. in a protobuf message, to a gRPC access log service, or in the Envoy docs it's referred to as ALS, access log service. All right, and that will happen according to the filter, you'll get, every request that has an access log, it will be streamed to that filter. I have a question. How hard is it to change the default behavior? It's not hard at all. It's all in the Envoy configuration. How are you using Envoy? If you're using Envoy directly, you can just go to the Envoy docs, and I'll show some of them in a second, and we can talk about how, show the different tweaks. But essentially, each of these external services has a corresponding configuration in Envoy with a lot of knobs you can tune. Right? So with XAuth and rate limit, I'll actually show external auth configuration in a second, and you'll see how to change the default behavior there. All right, next, metrics services. So as you know, Envoy has a stats page. We also show that in previous Hoots. In the stat page, you can get access to metrics in an Envoy format, in a Prometheus format. In addition to that, you can also export metrics to a gRPC service. You can also do it to statsd, but we'll focus on the metric service gRPC service in this Hoot. And what it does, it actually gets all the metrics into a gRPC message, you probably guessed by now, and sends them to a proto message, and sends them to a gRPC service on every interval, right? So rate limit, access log, XAuth, they're happening on a request basis. Metric service gets flashed to the gRPC service on an interval. So every thing, that the default is a few seconds, the metrics will be sent, right? So again, it's also something, if you have some custom integration that you need metrics for, you can use that. One more service I want to talk about, because it's kind of a different style of communication, is HDS. We're not going to demo HDS, but just going to talk about it a little bit. So HDS is Health Discovery Service. And what it allows an Envoy report the health status of its endpoint to the management plane. So let's say you have an Envoy and you define health checks on the Envoy, right? And Envoy is executing health checks to various endpoints. Often you have this problem and say, okay, all the Envoy perform health checks to all the upstream. It might increase the chatter in the network a lot. So this is kind of a way to mitigate that. You assign one Envoy to report the health status as it observes it to the management plane. And the management plane can then propagate the health status to other envoys using EDS. So this is Health Discovery Service. And the reason I'm mentioning it, just because it's a different communication style, it is kind of like an XDS style protocol, where XDS, when you think about it, is a means to synchronize essentially state or structure, right? It's a protobuf for that matter. So Envoy synchronizes the health status that it observes to the management plane with HDS. Now, in addition to the services we talked about, there's a bunch more services, and there's extension configuration discovery service where you can use it to provide an Envoy filters configuration from a different management plane than the main management plane, load reporting service, client status discovery service. I'm not going to go into all of those. In addition to what exists in Envoy, you can use WASM to implement your own service, whether in the request path or outside the request path. And maybe we'll leave that to another Hoot if people want to see how it's done in WASM. If you want to see it, go to our Hoot repo and do an episode request and say that you want to see that. That way I can know that it's something, a topic you're interested in. And, if you see an episode suggestion that you like do a vote up so we know there's more interest in that. If you want to see kind of the list of stuff that Envoy has as far as external services, you can go to the documentation, but the place that it's kind of concentrated in one place, it's in the API folder. Let me share my browser window here so you'll see what I'm talking about. So you have Envoy API, Envoy service, and this is all the configuration for external services. So if your use case requires some external configuration, you can kind of see what Envoy supports through browsing this list. Now, as I said, I'm going to show the external authorization configuration. And this is how you configure Envoy to use external authorization. And I'm just going to show how you can tweak the behavior. So you can see here that you have status on error, which is the status that gets returned on error. And by default, it's 403 forbidden, but if you want something else, you can use something else. And you can also see that you have, where is it? Failure allowed mode. So when failure allow mode is set, then whenever the check request fails, and again, it means kind of a network failure, the request will be allowed regardless, right? And these are configured on the filter in Envoy, and in a second we'll show where that is as we're about to get to our demo. Any questions up until now? And in the meantime, let me have some coffee. All right. So with that, let me open VS Code. Here we go. I hope you're seeing the code okay. If the font is too small, let me know and make it bigger. Let's talk about what we're seeing here. So this is an Envoy YAML that we'll use to demonstrate all the services, not all, but 4 of the services we talked about so far. We also have a minimal server implementation that we'll walk through in a second. So let's see what's happening here. So first thing in the Bootstrap configuration, we define a stat sync with the metrics service. And one thing you'll see in all these services is kind of this gRPC service definition. This is kind of a stanza in Envoy that will repeat itself. So we send it to a gRPC service. We use v3 version of the API, and I didn't put any more configuration here, but this configures Envoy to send metrics to this external gRPC service. All right, so this is StatSync. As you can see, it's a top level object in the Bootstrap config. So it's a configuration that applied across Envoy, across all the listeners in Envoy. All right, next up, we go to listeners, and in the listener, we have the HTTP connection manager. And in the HTTP connection manager, you can see that we have, one sec, this is not the HCM that I wanted. Here we go. You can see that we have access logs, and access log, it's a list, so it can be more than one. Like I said, if you want, you can have gRPC in addition to file. And you can see that we define an HTTP gRPC access log, and you can see that we have configuration for it. A common config, I just give it a log name because I have to. And again, it's the same gRPC stanza, and I'm just reusing the same service to implement all those services, right? So this is how you would define an access log that goes out to gRPC, right? So access logs are defined in the HTTP connection manager. There's a list of access log. In addition to name and type config, there's a filter you can specify it. I show that in the observability Hoot, so if you want, you can check out that episode to see how that is configured. For our purposes, I'm not doing any filtering. All the requests will get access log. And you can see that we're logging to a gRPC service. We have a log name. We also can add more properties here, like which extra headers to log, filter state we want to log. You can look at the Envoy documentation to get the full tweaks and knobs you have here. All right, so these are the 2 services that are outside the request path. Now we'll go into rate limit and XAuth, and because they're in the request path, we know there's got to be a filter implementing them, right? So let's go to that part. So you can see here we have HTTP filters, and the first filter is external auth. So you see we define external auth with the type config. Now the type config is the one that I showed the docs for, right? So if you want to change the failure behavior, you would do it right here, right? So here you could do failure mode allow, right? If you wanted to. So this is how you customize the default behavior, right? You put it on the configuration for the service you're using. So again, the same gRPC service, I'm just using the same one in all of them, but this defines a filter. This activates the external auth filter adds it to the filter chain, and when the request gets here, it will go out to an external authorization service. Next, we have the rate limit service, and again, the gRPC service stanza is the same. I define a rate limit service. We define a domain. This is just part of the rate limit API, and again, I'm not going to talk too much on how rate limit works, because that can also be a Hoot on its own. There's more to cover there than we have time on this Hoot. And in addition to defining the configuration here, one other thing we define for rate limiting is the rate limit descriptors on the route. And again, we're not going to talk about it this much, but it's just necessary for rate limiting to work to have some descriptors either on the route or on the virtual host. So the main takeaway is that these services, these external services that are on the request path, are implemented as filters, right? And if you want to implement your own, then if you're implementing something on the request path, you would do it as a filter, for example, a WASM filter. And if you're not doing it in the request path, you would do it, where relevant, as a Bootstrap extension or as an access log. My main goal is for you to kind of understand the Envoy architecture, so you know better how to customize it for your use case. And finally, as always with HTTP, we have the router filter. We have to have the router filter in the end of HTTP configuration, because the router filter is the filter that sends request upstream. And let me just undo. Here we go. Sorry. Here we go. So that's it. Clusters, we have some cluster. I call it some cluster. In our case, we're just going to do Python HTTP server to just have something serving on that port, and the external services cluster, which will start in a second. And you can see that the important part here is to add the HTTP2 protocol options, because it's a gRPC service and gRPC is only available with HTTP2. All right, so let's move to the interactive part. Let's start Envoy. I have here a podman command for that. Suspended. Why suspended? Nobody knows. Okay, let's try that again. Every time let me just copy paste it. That's the easy way. I don't know what's going on with my shell. It insists on suspending stuff, so I'll just open another shell. All right. So let's start our server. And all this code is available in GitHub if you want to follow along or try it yourself. So that's working. All right. Well, here we'll do our curls. All right. Now, before we start doing the curl, I just want to go over the server code. So our server is pretty basic. All that I do is implement all those gRPC services, right? So I use the Go control plane. The protos are generated to Go code there. So I import that, and then I just implement them. And you see, pretty basic implementation. In should rate limit, I just print that I rate limit, return OK. In check, I also just print that receive a check request, return an empty message, which means OK here. In stream access logs, unlike the check and the rate limit, this is a streaming request, meaning that Envoy sends multiple messages on the same gRPC stream. So again, we just print the path, and the response code. And in metrics, I just pick a specific metrics because there are a lot of metrics that will flood the output. So I just print the request total for the sum cluster upstream, and I print the counter of that metric. So that's kind of the server. I wire it all in, start it. That's basically it. Any questions on the code, on the Envoy config, on anything we've seen so far? All right, so let's see it live. Once I do a curl, let's get this. Hopefully the font size is big enough. You can see we get a request from the Python. You can see received a check request, which is the external auth filter, the first one in the chain. We receive the rate limit request, the filter after it in the chain. And if I'll change the filter order, the order of these lines will be swapped accordingly. All right, so this matches the filter chain ordering. Order is important on the filter chain. You can see that we received the access log in the path / and the response code was 200. So this is when the request is over, the access logs are created. And then you can see metrics, and if you recall, metrics are flashed on an interval. So you see that every interval, more metrics data is arriving. And in this case, the request count is 1, but I can do another request. And you can see the same lines are printed again, and request went up to 2. I can do a request to a path that doesn't exist. You can see we got a 404, right? And same check request. Should rate limit all appeared again, and the metrics count raised. Everything is clear up. I hope you mean in a good way, or do you mean the screen has issues? Let's assume it's in a good way for now. So hopefully this all makes sense. I want to kind of draw how it looks like on the filter chain level. So just to make sure everybody understand what they're seeing. So let's talk about how it looks like inside kind of Envoy, how it works. So let me share my drawing screen. Any questions so far? Does that all make sense with the code, with the Envoy config? Feel free to ask. So let's draw a little bit. So we have here a request coming. So first we have a user, right? Then we have a request coming to Envoy. Now Envoy has, Envoy has worker threads, and Envoy has the main thread. And when a request comes, it goes to a worker thread. Now it starts traversing the filter chain, right? So we have here, first we put xauth, we then put rate limit, let's do RL for short, and then in the end we have the router. Right, so the request goes to the worker thread, starts traversing the filter chain. For first filter it arrives at is xauth. So xauth sends a check request to the external service. Right, so this is a check request. Now this is what, when I said increased latency, while this check request is in progress, the original request is halted, right? So the time that it takes the check request to go and the time it takes for the external service to process the request, it's all adding latency to the request, right? So the service makes a decision, returns a response to the xauth filter, and then the xauth filter allows the request to continue down the chain. It makes it to the rate limit filter. Rate limit filter does the same, goes to the external filter, external service, which should rate limit, and again gets halts the request. It doesn't make any progress in the chain. Request comes back to the rate limit filter. The rate limit filter, assuming it's allowed, allows the request to continue down the chain. It arrives to the router filter. The router filter sends it to the upstream cluster. In our case, it's the Python service that lists the files on the current directory, but could be anything for that matter. Upstream does whatever processing it needs to do, sends it back to the router filter. the request traverses back in the filter chain, and when the request is done, the HCM filter is actually right here in the beginning of the chain, sends the access log, also access logs request. I see I have a question. For low latency request response, all external services should be near Envoy. Yes, that's correct. For example, in Glue, we have an option of deploying the external auth service as a sidecar to Envoy and use Unix sockets to communicate. So if you have something where you need to use external auth for some reason, but you want it latency sensitive, we can tweak that. And there's also connection parameters you can tweak in the Envoy cluster definitions. So there's a lot of knobs you can tune to kind of help manage the latency. All right, so all this stuff happens in the worker thread. Lastly, once everything is done, metrics, histograms counter are kind of flashed, and the main thread every interval sends the metrics also to the external service. So I hope this rough visualization makes sense. I got this tablet specifically to draw stuff for you in the Hoot, so let me know if you like the concept. I can't get a refund anymore if you don't, so hopefully you like it. But that's kind of the flow of information as far as Envoy kind of threads and filters. This is how it works. All right. Yeah, so this is basically all I have for today. If there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or leave a comment. I will monitor the comments in the next few days, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Also, feel free to go to our GitHub repo. So just an episode, the code is there. You can look at the examples and leave us some feedback if there's anything you want to see. Anything you want us to cover, more Envoy, more Istio, maybe a different technology, OPA, anything cloud native, let us know. And with that, thank you everybody for joining me today, and have a great day. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.